To recording. Um, well, very pleased to be joined by Dr. Barry Rabe, who's Professor Emeritus at the Ford School, University of Michigan, a leading expert on environmental policy in the United States, on states and environmental policy, as well as making big contributions on international environmental policy. And for today's conversation, we're really focusing on his role as co-editor of Environmental Policy: New Directions for the 21st Century. This is a key text, a foundational text in this field. It's in its 12th edition, so literally 40 years of providing understanding of what environmental policy is, how it's made, and in some ways the critical different institutions that are part of getting us to environmental policy in the United States. So, Barry, I'd like to just start in a sense with a broad question of as readers go through a book that looks at environmental policy, the different branches of government, the different key agencies and departments, topical takes on it, international takes on it. In a time of great change here in 2025, when we have big changes in administration and big changes in the offing on environmental policy, how should readers understand the history in those 40 years that you've captured over time in the book as a way to navigate where we are now and the change that's going on now?
Sure. First of all, Jeff, it's great to see you, and thanks for the invitation to have this conversation with you and ultimately with your students. I am mindful around this time a year ago, we were doing this in person. I came down to Athens for a week. It was great fun. And in recognition of that, I'm still wearing my Ohio University Bobcat jersey. We went to basketball games and we just had a great time. So nice to reconnect now. And so thank you. Um, I think this question of sort of what is immediate and current? What are we reading in the news this morning or picking up social media feed versus this historical context is so important in a class like yours. And it's really been the animating principle behind the book we're talking about since its inception, long before I entered into the playing field. It was literally one of the first things I read as a graduate student
Mhm.
way back when. And the focus then was dramatic change in American environmental policy because not Donald Trump, but Ronald Reagan had been elected to the presidency. And so this team of younger scholars, Michael Kraft, Norman Vick, came together and assembled the very first version of this. It's gone through many iterations. And there's always this question in this book, since I've joined the team in more recent times, how do you provide a larger perspective, explaining how we got to this point, what we've done well, what we haven't done well, what policies have been durable, which ones have fallen apart? How do we begin to think about these things and weigh that broader context with the more immediate and current? And obviously, a huge challenge with a book is at one point you have to kind of push the button and send it off for publication. And the minute after you do that, things are out of date. And right now, as we think about the 2025 experience, things are changing almost constantly. And yet, as we sit today, much of the infrastructure, the basic foundations of American environmental policy, even global environmental policy, are still there. They may be challenged, they may be about to be altered. But our view is that you really have to have that kind of foundational sense. It doesn't mean you need to know everything Jimmy Carter did or some other president, but you need to have that kind of larger range. And just as in the origins of the book, starting in the 1980s, the Reagan presidency, what was seen as likely to be a frontal challenge on clean air and clean water legislation. Uh, this book tries to pull from all of that, but also pick up a number of developments during now it's historic, the Biden presidency that now move into this more immediate and current period in some of the areas that you've already introduced.
Yeah. I think that kind of foundational knowledge is kind of essential. And so, as we think of the foundations, we think of the three branches of government, and it's reminiscent of kind of secondary school lessons and looking at the Congress and the executive branch and the courts. And the book has chapters on each one of those, and their roles have changed over time. As we're reading those chapters now, what is your advice for kind of what to latch onto and take from that history, and then also kind of where are you looking going forward to understand that these may be changing, right? In terms of kind of based in the history and going forward, what should we be thinking about when we're reading those chapters?
Sure. And if we might, let's start with Congress. Um, in that case, Michael Kraft, a co-editor of the book, has continued to pursue a deep understanding of Congress in many facets of environmental policy. And yet, one thing that is really distinct about the version of the book, the edition of the book that you and your students now have before you, is that that really captured a major, major shift within Congress for many years and decades. And you and I have had separate conversations about this. Congress, regardless of the party in control of Congress and the president, really struggled to pass either new environmental legislation or climate legislation or to update existing legislation. The last reauthorization of the Clean Air Act was 1990. Clean Water Act, even older than that. So the issues of Congress struggling to find a role and to reach consensus, whether we're talking about all Democratic government, all Republican government, or some mix, has been a real challenge. The author, Mike Kraft, has struggled with that for some time. And yet, what's so different about the version that you have before you is that we literally had from 2020 to 2023 an explosion, really, of new legislation, even in the last stages of the first Donald Trump administration. A bipartisan bill passed called the AIM Act, AIM, American Innovation and Manufacturing Act, to deal with a major phase down of cooling sector chemicals that cause profound short-term climate impacts. Um, that's still in play. In 2021, major infrastructure legislation passed with some degree of bipartisan support, signed into law by former President Biden. Lots of new funding for environmental, climate-friendly infrastructure. EVs charging stations we're hearing a lot about. But then the big one, the Inflation Reduction Act, passed with only Democratic Party support in 2022.
Mhm.
Major spending investment initiatives across the board in climate, energy, environment. And that one is going to be clearly in the crosshairs. But what's so unique about, again, this chapter is that Michael Kraft was actually able to talk about the adoption of these three laws, and they're all in still relatively new early stages. So seeing how kind of policy windows open, as we often think about when windows of opportunities emerge to create policy, we've just gone through a period where quite a bit of new action has occurred. Now, with that, it sets up, I think, 2025 and beyond in some interesting ways. Would Congress actually reverse or repeal any of those laws, including ones where there was some degree of bipartisan support? We might think back to the Affordable Care Act of 2009. And yet, despite all of the challenges, a major healthcare bill that passed in 2009 is still the law of the land and doesn't seem as if it's going to be reversed fully. I think it'll be fascinating for you and your students to kind of watch this play out. And one tool, there's brief reference in the chapter, might be especially interesting in the first months of this semester, and that is something called the Congressional Review Act. Sounds like kind of a broad general statute. At one level, it is. And what it means is in certain circumstances where an administration, in this case, the Biden administration, completes a lot of administrative rules, legal interpretations of different policies toward the end of their term of office. If in the next presidency, in relatively short amount of time, I won't take you through all the technical details, you could actually have a bill or versions of this that would reverse all or pieces or portions of a law. And by doing that, it not only eliminates the law, but prevents a future administration from basically reintroducing the same thing. And we've seen this kind of whipsawing back and forth in terms of how presidents of different parties view environment, not just Biden to Trump, but George W. Bush, Bill Clinton to George W. Bush on through the Obama administration and the like. We've seen relatively little use historically of the CRA because there is a narrow window. Congress has to come together quickly. In this case, all Republicans would have to hold together. There have been many, many resolutions introduced in Congress in just the last weeks to propose doing this. None have come close to a vote yet, and I think that's going to be a great early test of just sort of what holds. And it might not be something that would appear in other texts because it is such an emerging sort of an issue. I think another piece to watch though is for these spending funding initiatives because the Inflation Reduction Act and the infrastructure legislation were big on investments, spending government
Mhm.
money. In the terms of the United States Senate, and the chapter goes into this quite nicely, there's usually a supermajority requirement to pass legislation in the Senate, 60 out of 100 members. That's super difficult and is a big part of why Congress has struggled to pass the legislation. There is a provision in the Senate known as reconciliation. And if you can convince the Senate parliamentarian that a bill is principally about taxation or spending, you can bring down that cap, the number of votes you need from 60 to 50. This is how the Inflation Reduction Act was passed. 50 votes in the Senate, all Democratic. Former Vice President Harris breaks the tie. We may see something like that used, and yet we may not. But the attraction here is because this is not a regulation policy or an enforcement policy. It is more of a spending policy or a taxation policy. Some pieces in this could be reversed, including the first ever tax on a greenhouse gas, the methane fee, which I think, I remember talking with you and your students about when I visited Athens a year or so ago. So those are a few thoughts there. So I think all the historical stuff is very, very relevant, but do keep in mind that this chapter is loaded with very immediate and current history that's never been in this textbook before. And in part because scholarly wheels turn slowly, it's not going to appear much in other books. This is a real kind of a bonus that you get with this particular chapter because, Mike was all over these new developments and has a great set of appendices. And there's just a lot of data there that for students to pull on to kind of understand Congress or think about what's going on today, tomorrow, next week.
Mhm. And obviously, the executive is charging ahead with a lot of these changes. Some of them trying to pull back spending and roll back policies. We'll see about the new kind of what regulatory and let alone statutory moving forward. But it really seems to already highlight how important the judicial branch is and the courts, where because these changes are so contested, we've gone straight to the courts, even just in the first few weeks of the administration. What are you anticipating there, and how should readers be understanding kind of where we've been and where we might go?
And specifically the case of the courts. Sure. So here we have a chapter from a relative newcomer to this book, Kimberly Smith. She's a University of Michigan colleague of mine, formerly at Carleton College in Minnesota. And she's an unusual scholar because she has both a law degree, a JD, and a PhD in political science. So she's kind of the perfect person from our standpoint to bring these things together. She makes clear that the federal courts are in a period of change and a period of uncertainty. It is no secret that there were a great many new appointments to the federal bench, including the Supreme Court during the first Donald Trump presidency, but actually even more lower court judges during the Biden presidency. And we're even kind of getting a sense of this. We tend to talk more and more about judges in terms of not just when they were appointed or, where they're from, but what president appointed them, this sort of politicization of the judiciary. And yet with it, and Kim picks up on this nicely, lots of uncertainties and questions, especially when we get to this front and center issue right now of how much power a president has or should have to reverse or approve executive actions by a president. Here we begin to talk about the court as guardrails. It's a branch of unelected but presidentially appointed, confirmed by the Senate, judges who serve for life. There are no term limits. And as cases kind of work their way up the system, what will emerge? Couple of interesting things to consider here. It is not at all clear that just because a majority of the current occupants of the Supreme Court, those 9 members, were Trump or Republican nominees, it doesn't mean that they necessarily hold the same views on executive power as does the president and his advisors. We have some precedent in American politics to see presidents see powers of the executive branch as very, very expansive. Going back to Andrew Jackson in the 1800s, excuse me. Um, Earlier presidents have really kind of pushed and tested executive power. All recent presidents have been at some point overturned by the Supreme Court, including former President Obama, whose Clean Power Plan was just slammed by the Supreme Court as an overreach. So there's clearly tension here. And there's some really interesting questions. We've even seen in the last few weeks when there are questions about the role of Elon Musk or the DOGE or cutting back spending. What powers does a president have? And a few interesting things emerge. Who actually has standing to bring a case in federal court? You, Ohio, your students, the local industry, Ohio University, who actually has that base? And that's being tested. One thing, and it's something we've seen a lot in recent years, the chapter talks about this, is the ability of states to go into court to challenge actions by a president with which they disagree. Here, the role of states and attorneys general, most of whom are elected on a partisan basis, becomes significant. And already we see the president acts, Mr. Trump acts, or someone in his administration acts, and within 24, 48, 72 hours, some coalitions of attorney generals outside the president's party, in this case Democratic, jump in and say that is executive overreach that tramples state rights. We're seeing a number of cases that are gaining standing and working through the courts, not necessarily beginning at the Supreme Court, but working their way up the system. So I would think over the next few years, certainly over the time you have with your students, but beyond that, we're going to see issues of executive power, the role of Congress, the role of states, tested in all sorts of ways, some of which are probably unimaginable at this moment because the Trump administration keeps bouncing and declaring emergency powers. Does the president have the ability to impose tariffs across the board in lots and lots of ways? Um, some early cases I would say to watch, one that's going to be coming up this semester. The first oral arguments on this are going to come soon, just in a few weeks, is known as Texas versus the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission. In this case, it appears that the Trump administration view is pretty similar to the Biden administration, that the disposal for nuclear waste, high level nuclear waste in reactors in Ohio, Michigan, all over the country, that's an intensely dangerous form of waste, high radioactivity, and requires 10 or 1,000 or more years of disposal for safety to be arrived at. This is an issue that's been kicking around for decades. It was actually covered initially in the very first edition of this book in 1984 as a work in progress. It's still a work in progress. And so what has happened is there's been now a proposal by a private firm in Texas, but along the New Mexico border, to move all the nuclear waste from the U.S. to a temporary interim. That's what it's called, a storage site above ground on that border in Texas. Interestingly, Texas, which is totally supportive of nuclear energy and gung-ho on energy expansion, actively opposes this. And so one of the things that the court is going to have to sort out just in the coming weeks is who's right? The federal government pushing for a resolution of this, but to move that waste, or that state. And you can play this out across any number of scenarios, but that's kind of an early case to think about and watch that raises, for me anyway, just a whole bunch of issues to consider.
So you mentioned that kind of immediate response from attorneys general from Democratic states or state where they're Democrats. Um, you literally wrote the chapter on state policymaking. So that's one role, that kind of pushback to federal change. Where do you see the action in the states and kind of where they've been and where they're going forward? Because we default to looking to Washington in the federal level, But as you just illustrated, the states play a critical role in multiple ways.
They really do. And it doesn't mean that, all we have to do is shut things down in Washington and let states manage things. One of the factors driving the creation of those federal laws, the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, creation of agencies like the Environmental Protection Agency, was because state commitment and capacity in some of these areas was so limited and uneven to create a more national or consistent framework for dealing with some of these issues and challenges. And yet the state role never really goes away. Even when you go to an agency like the US EPA, more than two-thirds of the work staff does not work in Washington, D.C. They work in a regional office, often working with states. Um, that really, really continues. And this is one that been deeply interested in for some time, the question of sort of the relationship between state and federal government. And here I would argue that if we look at, say, the last 25 years, we have tended to see, especially when we have a Republican elected to the presidency who pulls back on the federal regulatory role. George W. Bush, the first Donald Trump, the second Donald Trump. Doesn't always have to be a Republican president, but that has been the pattern.
Mhm.
We then shortly thereafter see a surge or a resurgence of state involvement on climate change issues. That can be attorneys general, but it also can be a great many other states. Over 20, literally 20 years ago, I wrote a book called State House and Greenhouse. And it asks why an issue like climate change, global warming, where we're seeing inertia in Washington, D.C., kind of gridlock over these issues. But so many states, including at that time Ohio, including at that time Michigan, were beginning to take some steps. And already in the days and weeks before, since the election and since the inauguration, we're already seeing new state government initiatives emerge. They're not identical, but in some cases, whether they use the word climate change, greenhouse gas, or they're pursuing air, water, other kinds of goals, this is a very interesting development. And I think these months, the first 4 or so months of years that end with an odd number, which is where we are now,
Mhm.
are super interesting because almost every state legislature is in session during this winter and into early spring. Many state legislatures, even in places like Texas, are only in session for certain months of a 2-year time period after an election. And yet you can look at pretty much every state house in the United States right now, including Michigan, but also Texas, North Dakota, New Hampshire. This is the period, January, February, March, April of that odd year after an election, where we kind of test again what is going to happen on environmental issues for the states, especially if it involves new legislation. So in that sense, I think for students, it's a great time whether you're thinking about Ohio, West Virginia, whatever, to kind of monitor what is going on. And, to be candid, I'll talk about conversations I'm having with my students, including a number of whom had accepted internships at the federal level or had recently been hired. And more their conversations, if they're from the United States, we have a lot of international students at U of M, uh, are maybe I want to think about a career path that brings me more to my home state
Mhm.
or region or locality. Had a long conversation not long ago with a former student who was weighing a federal offer with one from her home state, and she has no regrets that she's working very happily in her state capital and has full funding and support. So I think it's a great moment for students who are kind of at different stages of career planning, development, or reinventing their career to kind of think about where they could have the greatest impact, especially if we're going to be going through at least a few years here where opportunities to engage within the government might be limited at the federal level. So my hope is that the chapter engages that. And what I try to do in that chapter, and I have throughout its history, is to kind of speak out of both sides of my mouth, being a good academic, right? I'm hedging my bets. But, here's some of the like really interesting, innovative things that states are doing.
Mhm.
Here are some of the continued limitations or problems or shortcomings. And then I often invite my students to kind of mix it up
Mhm,
and debate what they see happening, particularly in a specific state. In our case, it would be Michigan.
mhm, mhm. Yeah, well, there's some good professional development and job decision advice in there too. But look to the states, right, for engagement at this kind of period on issues like climate change and folks who want to work in that space and work on it where there is likely to be increased activity. So that's really helpful in ways that kind of follow directly from the book and your analysis.
And
Um,
actually, if I just could
yeah,
interject,
of course.
I neglected to say there is one other chapter that I'm really, really excited about in this edition that is entirely new. It is by Sarah Hughes, a former University of Michigan colleague, and Aaron Deslott, who's at Indiana University. And what's so great about this is they look at some of the very same things that we were just talking about, but they think about urban and local government issues. And I'm also hearing a lot from my students who are really, really interested in this. And there are a surprising number of opportunities, employment opportunities, a kind of local sustainability space we're seeing certainly in Michigan, but around the country. And that is like, I think, a super new chapter. And they're both young scholars, they're cutting edge scholars, and they basically try to incorporate their recent years of engagement on these issues into a really tight and cogent chapter. And so I only put that in because when we often see these sort of shifts as well at the local, whether it's county, municipal, you name it level. So I just wanted to add on, Geoff, my strong recommendation for students who are thinking in these terms to take a look at that wonderful chapter.
No, that's terrific because I think a lot of our students have historically wanted to and gone on to focus at the local levels, and I think the moment suggests that that is really a way to productively have a focus and be able to see progress and see achievements in working in this space. So that's terrific that that chapter's there. Um, Maybe a final question to again draw on your previous scholarship and what it informs, how it informs us today, which is, although it was just 4+ years ago, the last Trump administration, the first one, you've written about that extensively, and so I guess my question would be, having looked closely at the first Trump administration environmental policy. What are the kind of elements of continuity that you see or are expecting, and which are ones that are kind of different strands from even just the previous time that Donald Trump was president?
Sure. And so what I'll say should probably be prefaced by I really misread some things going on in the first Trump administration. I was running a major research center that was focused on state and local policy issues at the University of Michigan. And we were kind of all in at looking at some of the Obama initiatives on climate that would involve states in significant ways. And so, what I had not anticipated, I'm not talking about predicting the 2016 election, is how aggressive the Trump administration could be to try to reverse actions of his predecessor without ever going to Congress.
Mm,
In that case, though, it was a series of executive orders and statements by the Obama presidency that were reversed by presidential action. It wasn't a president responding to what Congress had actually done and put into formal statute. And so that's a fundamental shift from this time to the last. It was, I think, at one level, a lot easier for Trump 1 to reverse Obama than it's going to be for Trump 2 to reverse Biden and Congress in multiple steps, those pieces of legislation that I mentioned. So that's one important difference. It's a lot harder for a president to just rip apart a piece of law. And we're already beginning to see on things like cutting funding for the Inflation Reduction Act to southern districts, southern state districts. The irony here being that predominantly Republican states voted against the legislation, but the bulk of legislation, excuse me, the bulk of funding there is going to those very states. And we're already seeing some Republicans beginning to say we don't really want those things to disappear, in part because whether we believe in climate change or not, they're providing economic benefits. And so that's going to be a really, really tricky one. It's so easy to get caught up in the day to day. Where is Elon Musk going today? Or who's going to get termination numbers messages tomorrow? And, buyout issues and all this. And it's a really serious set of issues and changes. And as we speak, most of these haven't really hit the environmental natural resource agencies fully yet. We don't know where this is going to go. So those are a couple of pieces and provisions. That said, one thing that is also different this time is the aggressive early preparedness that this administration has from day one to try to enforce its will on the American people, but also on Congress and the courts through very aggressive early action. I think it's safe to say that in 2016, it's not even clear Donald Trump thought he was going to win the presidency, much less prepare for it. In this case, he has his prior term and 4 years where he's been, gnashing his teeth, waiting to get back. And so there's this immediate kind of push and press. You have people who've been appointed to executive office who seem to be much more willing to push these buttons within days rather than months or even years. Uh, it's a willingness to kind of try all kinds of strategies, even though the courts might ultimately overturn. It is aggressive. And from my way of thinking, it's much more aggressive in trying to eliminate a reverse policy than we've seen in any president in the life of this book, going back to decades before I joined the project and Ronald Reagan. So I don't want to underestimate that at all. I do think, though, there is this question of guardrails and three potential avenues that could be putting some significant constraints. When, why, how does Congress ultimately push back and say no, or hold the line on some of these things, especially as you get into spending changes on the IRA or other pieces and provisions? I think the court issue, which we've discussed, is significant. And here again, I would just note that, and this was a major theme of the book I wrote with a couple of colleagues, at the start of the Biden presidency, it was released, that looked at the first Trump administration, and that is the ability of states to push back hard, particularly through these efforts by state attorneys general. Uh, they are organized, they are active. We also saw Republican attorneys general in the Biden administration, so it goes two ways, do much the same thing. So there's this already an aggressive effort to counter an unbelievably aggressive president, and it's impossible at this moment to know where all of this is going to play out. I would only say, and I think this is consistent with themes of the book, is it's important for your students to think about knowing on a daily, weekly, monthly basis changes that are occurring, but keep all of this into a much, much larger context. Um, Much of this is likely to endure. We are only now, months away from the 2026 midterm elections. Who knows how that's going to turn out? All of this is going to be a work in progress rather than a finished deal. And so it makes it, in many respects, a super exciting time for you and your students to be teeing all of this up.
Terrific. Well, Barry, this is hugely helpful in providing a context and a way, a set of questions and areas to be thinking about as we're reading this book and as we're understanding the changes that are going on and trying to anticipate them and see where they're going, but importantly, putting them in these historical contexts and the foundations of environmental policy in the U.S. So really want to thank you for sharing today, and we look forward to all the future insights that you and your co-editors will be providing with this book going forward. So thank you so much.
Absolutely my pleasure, Jeff. If it is any consolation, we are in the stages of trying to prepare for the next edition. It's like finishing an academic year. You get things done, you go on to the next one. But there won't be a new edition out, certainly in the life of this academic year, but we're starting to work on it. And so thank you for your good questions and for helping me in some respects think through what ought to go into that new edition. I would only say, and this is an invitation I've mentioned to you before, but your students, in all seriousness, we want to keep this book going. We all really love doing it. And if you have reactions, thoughts,
Mhm.
gaps, things we need to do, chapters add, chapters to drop, feel free to drop me a line anytime. I would be really, really grateful. And actually, one thing I neglected to mention that we actually did, I put into a number of portions of this book, including the concluding chapter, um, is to really think about issues of trade
Mhm.
and how trade policy is coming together more and more than ever before in environmental or climate policy. We actually use in this book the word tariff more than ever before. And
Mhm.
in that last chapter, I get into trade issues. I didn't anticipate, all the tariff proposals, but they're out there. And so we get at these issues, including some of the areas where historically we have not been as involved in the book, including agriculture and
Mhm.
some of the other sectors that can often be ignored. So we try to make adjustments, but if you and your students upon review have suggestions, I'd love to see them. And I
Great.
certainly wish you all well going forward.
Terrific. Well, we'll provide that opportunity to gather that feedback up and share it with you. That's terrific. That's a great invitation. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks again for the invite. For
Yeah.
the invite. I enjoyed it.
Thank you, Barry.